Hi, welcome. I'm Stephanie Mortis Stevens. I'm an editor with Trinity University Press, and I had the pleasure and honor to work with Simmons, Elizabeth, and Derek on bringing this book together and bringing it to life and to you tonight. As a mission-driven organization, Trinity publishes each book with great intentionality, and we're proud of them all. But it's rare that a book has such urgency that Dear America has today. It's a critical collection for the times we live in and a call to action with the challenges we face today. Working on this book, I consider myself to be pretty politically aware. I read the news, keep up with all of the issues of the day, but working on this book and reading it again since it's been published, the voices and the stories have woken me out of that complacency, and it just has served as a reminder to me that it's so important to share these stories and to repeat them and to talk about them. And some of those books that touch me, some of those pieces from the book that touch me most deeply are going to be shared tonight. And I'm so excited that you get to hear them wherever you are from some of our contributors that Simmons will introduce in just a bit. These Dear America town hall events have been going on for the past couple months. And in them, we explore different themes, including, but not limited to, the natural environment, violence and injustice, activism and protest. And tonight's topic is Other Americas, Writing Across Geographies and Heritages, which addresses both the physical borders between us, but more often than not, it's the boundaries that are a little more elusive, but no less tangible, that really challenge us and cause some of the bigger issues in our society today. The event tonight is also streamed live on Facebook and archived there, and also at Trinity University Press webpage, which is tupress.org. The print and ebook are also available at your favorite neighborhood or online retailer, but it is also available at a special price just for you at dearamericabook.org. In light of the current times, please also consider buying additional copies for family, friends, neighbors, colleagues, or as a donation to your local library. This is a book we all need to read right now. To me, it helps calmly but honestly assess where we are and give me hope for the future, both alone and together. Now, speaking of being together, it is my pleasure to introduce Simmons Buntin, one of the 3 editors of Dear America, along also with Elizabeth Dodd and Derek Sheffield, who are watching out there. Simmons is also the editor-in-chief of Terrain.org and the director of Terrain Publishing. Thank you and enjoy.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, and thank you all for being here. I'm really delighted to host this evening's reading with such terrific writers and thinkers and citizens of the Americas and the world, and why not, the Neowise Comet and the solar system and the Milky Way, and heck, the universe much beyond. On behalf of myself and my co-editors, Elizabeth Dodd and Derek Sheffield, welcome and thanks so much for being here. Tonight's town hall and reading is themed, as Stephanie said, The Other Americas, Writing Across Geographies and Heritage. Before we begin, I want to say, though, just a bit more about this wonderful book, Dear America, Letters of Hope, Habitat, Defiance, and Democracy. Let's see if I can figure that out there. It's such a powerful, okay, I'm biased, but it's such a powerful, diverse, and necessary collection of prose and poetry and artwork. And it's important to note, too, I think, that of the 130 contributions in the book, 50 were not previously published. These are letters that don't appear on Terrain.org online series. So even if you read Terrain.org regularly, and I hope you all do, of course, you'll want a copy of this book. If you go to dearamericabook.org, that's Dear America Book, all one word, you can get that 20% off of each copy you purchase. And I also want to note that all royalties from the book donated by the editors and all contributors go to three important nonprofits. First, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and then the Natural Resources Defense Council, and the American Civil Liberties Union, split equally between them. So this portal, dearamericabook.org, is the way to maximize those funds going to those stalwart organizations. Or of course, you can go through the bookseller of your choice, perhaps supporting your local bookstore. Meanwhile, the online series continues. We've published now 188 letters at Turing.org, including last Friday, a gorgeous letter by Jacob Margolis, a New Yorker who writes of community and empathy and family and his own long recovery from COVID-19. We invite you to visit Turing.org after tonight's town hall to read Jacob's wonderful letter. And while you're there, please take note of the website's new design and a couple recent additions. First, we've added a Teach Terrain.org section, which is a robust resource devoted to helping teachers and community groups use Terrain.org as a place-based, ad-free, no-cost resource for education and discussion. And then we've recently articulated our statement on racial justice with our commitments to action. But now it's time to turn to our readers, and we'll go in this order: Diana, Francisco, and Sandra. And I will introduce each one before they read. So for the audience members, if your question comes to mind as you listen, please send it through the Q&A button. And then we'll have probably 15, 20 minutes perhaps for that conversation at the end. So first, let me introduce Diana. Diana Babineau is the managing editor of In These Times, a lefty social justice and labor-focused magazine in Chicago, and she is a consulting editor for the Kenyon Review. She is previously the managing editor for Orion and The Common, and has copy edited and proofread books for the University of the West Indies Press and the children's book publisher Levine Corrido. She was a fall 2019 poetry mentee in the AWP Writer to Writer program, and her poetry has appeared or is forthcoming in The Common, North American Review, and elsewhere. Welcome, Diana, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Simmons, and thank you to Terrain and Trinity University Press for having me read tonight and for putting this together. I'm really delighted to be included in this anthology and to be reading alongside Francisco and Sandra and Dean tonight. So thank you all for tuning in. I'd like to start by reading Laurette Savoy's essay in this anthology, which appears in the same section that my poem appears, and which I think touches on a lot of questions that I've been thinking about since childhood. I grew up biracial in a very, very white neighborhood in Connecticut with two immigrant parents, one of whom is white and one of whom is Black. And Laurette's essay and the two poems I'll read after explore identity, belonging, and what it means to exist in a country that is so deeply exclusionary and violent toward people that aren't white. So I'll begin with Laurette's essay, An American Question. To my country. An old and perhaps unanswerable question has troubled me since childhood. Now it won't let me rest. The Revolutionary War had entered its final years still undecided when J. Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur asked, "What then is the American, this new man?" Most of the soon-to-be former colonists would probably agree with his response, published in 1782 in Letters from an American Farmer. He is a European, or the descendant of a European, who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds. He makes a new race of men whose labors and posterity will one day cause great changes in the world. So many others were excluded from this definition: women, indigenous peoples, as well as 1/5 of the population of the fledgling United States, whose labors had driven the economies of all 13 colonies. Slavery and its profits, whether from tobacco, cotton, sugar, or rice, buttressed the new republic. National prosperity would continue to depend on exploiting cheap labor and exploiting land once dispossessed of its original inhabitants. Part and parcel of this new mode of life were adaptive prejudices, concepts of race, whiteness, and white supremacy. The social and political community imagined as the new nation by the founding property holders had to be carefully guarded. Although recent assaults on this country's civil society might seem unprecedented, de Clevequeur's question has always been contested ground. Any expanding membership in the imagined community of we the people was answered time and again by tightened boundaries. Radical Reconstruction, for instance, defined and broadened the reach of US citizenship with the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th and 15th constitutional amendments. Those men once enslaved could now, in principle, enjoy equal protection under the law without regard to race. They could own land, they could run for office, they could vote, until the surge toward justice fell with the compromise presidential election of 1876. A retrenching racial hierarchy promised white redemption, and not only in the South. It would take the 1964 Civil Rights Act to make it again into law, what had been gutted when Reconstruction was abandoned. And the era of Jim Crow would also see immigration quotas. In spring 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first major federal law restricting immigration. That statute, with its extensions, would stand in force for 6 decades in the name of racial purity. As a child, I stumbled over with liberty and justice for all, wondering if there was an elastic limit to realized citizenship while my schoolmates recited the Pledge of Allegiance. These 6 words seemed at odds with the ceaseless media images. TV news alone brought into our home each night footage of war, assassinations, and protests by people who looked like me. I came of age doubting claims of incremental progress, yet still wanting to believe in expanding tolerance, if not equality. But I wasn't so naive as to believe the nation had entered a post-racial, post-racist age with Barack Obama's presidency, not when white supremacists and hate groups had proliferated in the last decade. Not when an opportunistic presidential campaign in 2016 could exalt ignorance, suspicion, and fear to feed racism, xenophobia, and misogyny and win. Not when many white voters, of all economic classes, perceived that campaign's promise to be redemption. In the age of Trump, the clock has turned back yet again on civil rights. The rule of power and profit reigns supreme. White nativists vilify Muslim, Mexican, and other non-white immigrants as alien. A nuclear arms race and other military threats escalate. Environmental regulations and protected lands fall prey to oil and gas plunder or mining. Climate science and language are censored despite global changes more rapid than predicted. Perceptions of race cut sharper, more divisive lines. Taking back the country to make America great again can mean many things. One, of course, is the monochromatic need of whiteness to believe this nation is what it never was, except in the minds and rhetoric of those longing for it to be so. Their public memory requires amnesia and selective erasure of different peoples and cultures, long part of the American experience. It is tempting here to exhort, to warn, to urge, to insist, we must, we should, we need to, but changing any situation for the better requires knowing what it really is. And key to this, I believe, is comprehending how forms of othering have always been central to the democratic project that is the United States. The seeming paradox between an American creed of liberty and justice for all and the realities of an American promise denied to members of marginalized groups is instead a malignant symbiosis. Transgression in word and deed, the root meaning of outrage, has occurred each day in the polarizing age of Trump. One step toward confronting and defying injustice begins with the grasping of the paradox and contradiction in the heartwood of this society. Innocence is not an option. Neither is hopelessness. The first documented arrival of Africans in the English colonies on mainland North America took place in August 1619. 400 years later, I don't know if we the people can acknowledge with honesty our intercultural past to present and thus admit many varied responses to who is an American. I had hoped, though, that more than half a century after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., this nation might see itself more clearly. Yours, Laureate Edith Savoy. And now I'll just read 2 quick poems of mine, which I like to think of as sister poems. The first appeared in this anthology, and it's called first picture day in America for my Haitian mother. The photographs are proof she's found an angle where the camera can't quite catch her squarish jaw, the width of her nose, or her low-boned cheeks above which two dark pupils stare emphatically. A side glance, one brow slightly higher than the other, raised in perpetual judgment of, well, no one meets her standards nowadays. She counts the seconds down, a flash, it's done. Her face relaxes, smile recedes, then feigns indifference as the next set of features, blue eyes bright against a rosy white, fill the frame, and more after that. Later, in darkish hands, she turns the photo over, exposing its colorless sheen, and folds it into herself until she's part of that ivory gloss, that perfect blank. And then the sister poem that I'll end with appeared in the Common, and it's called What My Father Said. You go where you belong, my father says to me, 10 years old, listening at bedtime to his story about how he once was mugged in Brooklyn in 1974, a small, polite Canadian trying to buy gas and a Coke. Like here, he meant, in this neighborhood where crime is low, a 94% white suburb in Connecticut, where the poorest homes are decently lit apartment complexes, at night only mildly rustling with ruckus and weeds. Like here, where everyone looks the same as everyone else, but me, my siblings. Like here, in his pale arms, holding me as I cry stupidly over what he had to endure, the horror of losing your wallet, not knowing yet that he and I have different things to lose. That my body, brown against these ivory sheets, washed and pressed by my mother's brown hands, is not the same. That my grasp of the world is yet too small for me to know where a girl like me belongs. Where should I go? I ask him. How will I know when I'm there? Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. What a powerful set of poems. I'm a little envious that we don't have that other one to go with yours, but I guess we'll give that to the Common. And I'll be sure to let Lorette know that you read her essay. She will be delighted and honored. As a reminder to folks, please post any questions in the Q&A feature if you'd like us to address those after the reading. Now it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Francisco Cantu, who is a writer, translator, and the author of The Line Becomes a River, winner of the 2018 Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Nonfiction. The recipient of an Art for Justice Fellowship, his writing and translations have been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times, and VQR. A lifelong resident of the Southwest, he now lives in Tucson, where he coordinates the Field Studies and Writing program at the University of Arizona. Francisco?
Thank you all for having me. And this is the first reading that I've participated in any form since the pandemic started. So it feels nice to tap into some of this community, and it's an honor to read alongside you all. I want to start actually with an essay that's by Scott Warren, and I actually saw Scott's name as one of our attendees tonight. So Scott, I hope it's okay with you that I'm reading your work, and you could send a quick message to the chat if it's not, and I'll abort. But I wanted to read the essay, Scott's essay, and my short essay that I'll read are sort of representing two manifestations of sort of landscapes of border enforcement, militarized and criminalizing spaces. So this is called Virtually Uninhabited by Scott Warren. Dear America, the law enforcement ranger escorted us out of Cabeza Prieta. out of Cabeza Prieta wilderness for having driven our pickup on a road open only to law enforcement vehicles. He also suspected that we had left behind jugs of water and cans of beans, or, to put it another way, that we had littered. Not quite sure what to do with us, he took our information and said that someone from the refuge would be in contact. After months of silence, I was served a summons to appear in federal court on misdemeanor charges of abandonment of property and operating a motor vehicle in wilderness. Since this incident, I have reflected on a recurring dream I had while backpacking and camping trips when I was younger. In the dream, we hiked for miles into some beautiful and remote mountain valley. But once we arrived, we were shocked to find that instead of pristine wilderness, there were 4x4 vehicles, roads, and industry. One time, while on a backpacking trip in the Sierra Nevada with my dad, I woke from a version of this dream feeling defeated and depressed until I realized that the wilderness in which we slept remained safe from actual assault. I was first attracted to Cabeza Prieta by those who had written about it. Its desert mountain ranges and valleys comprise one of the remaining wild places of the lower 48. And when combined with the adjacent Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument and the Goldwater bombing range, it made a large expanse of unbroken Sonoran desert that was about the size of Connecticut. One of those who wrote about this place was Edward Abbey, who worked as a seasonal ranger at Organ Pipe and loved this part of the desert. Abbey's environmental writings about Organ Pipe and Cabeza Prieta decried the intrusion of copper mines and ranchers whose cattle overgrazed the desert. But he also wrote racist passages about non-white people, especially Mexican immigrants, whom he feared contributed to overpopulation and destruction of America's wild places. His approach to curtail immigration and secure the border was quite troubling. In a 1980 letter to the editor of the New York Review of Books, he argued, quote, "Most of the border runs through flat, wide open, sparsely vegetated terrain and could be easily patrolled and easily sealed by a force of 20,000, properly armed and equipped." In the urban areas, he called for physical barriers that would be, quote, "watched and guarded." Abbey proposed this in the 1980s, a time when the informal migration of workers between Mexico and the United States was both routine and a source of anxiety for many Americans. Images of migrants running across the border in San Diego and El Paso populated media accounts of the region. By the 1990s, with anxieties increasing over the pending North American Free Trade Agreement, the United States government unveiled a new plan to seal its southern border. The plan was to deter migrants from crossing in the first place by imposing new hardships on them. Chief among these would be the natural environment. In the minds of government planners, the rugged, remote, and virtually uninhabited deserts and mountains of the border would form a natural wall, stopping most migrants before they even set out. Those who did brave the wide open deserts would be easy to spot and apprehend. Better to chase them around in the desert, according to the government, than around downtown El Paso. So they built walls and beefed up security in cities and hoped that the desert would enforce itself. Instead, tens of thousands of people who had once crossed in urban areas now crossed in rugged and remote areas. As the years wore on, thousands of migrants died while crossing harsh landscapes. And it became clear that the strategy also relied on mass suffering, disappearance, and death as hardships, even as it failed to deliver the objectives. The government now argued that the Border Patrol needed reinforcements to respond to the security and humanitarian crisis unfolding. Ironically, each boost in border policing strengthened the hand of cartels in Mexico, and the tangled arms race-like escalation between the forces of smuggling and the forces of interdiction gave rise to a new kind of border industry. Abbey's plan has materialized. There are walls, watched and guarded, in every urban area on the border. About 20,000 well-armed and well-equipped Border Patrol agents maintain line watch, staff checkpoints, and conduct roving patrols. Those walls, checkpoints, surveillance towers, tire drags, high-intensity enforcement zones, and tens of thousands of miles of new roads and tire tracks laid down by the Border Patrol are the industrial scars left behind in the Cabeza Prieta and other protected areas. The border industry now threatens these wild protected places in the same way that copper mining and unfettered grazing did a generation ago. Most troubling is the myth that undergirds the government's use of cabeza prieta, organ pipe, and other protected areas for border enforcement. The deeply held American myth of free and open land is one of the core tenets of colonialism and conquest. In the border region, this history is not ancient, but rather recent, and it pervaded the creation of the wilderness in the first place. In the middle part of the 20th century, Native, Mexican, and Anglo farmers, ranchers, prospectors, and woodcutters were displaced from this part of the desert to create protected reserves. In the 1950s, for instance, the National Park Service razed the homes and orchards of the Orozco family and the Hiased Odom Native community in which they lived in order to make the desert appear more, quote, natural. Both the wilderness mystique and the government's rhetoric of virtually uninhabited served to make this place an eerily blank slate. According to his wishes, Abbey was buried somewhere in the Organ Pipe and Cabeza Prieta wilderness. His friends rescued him from the hospital and brought him to his final resting place in the desert he loved so much. No doubt, many thousands of migrants have passed his grave on the journey north, and hundreds of these, perhaps 1,000 or more, have died in the same wilderness in which Abbey now rests. For several years, I have gone into these places as a humanitarian volunteer to leave water and food for migrants, to search for those who are lost, and to recover those who have died. Like the Sierra Nevada of my childhood, the Cabeza Prieta to me seems big, wild, and wide open. But I have new dreams about the wilderness. In these dreams, an unknown vehicle approaches at night, driving with its lights off while I sleep in my tent. The helicopter descends on our isolated campsite and blows hot embers from the cooking fire into the night sky. Saguaro are silhouetted on a mountainside by incendiary flames. Migrants in desperate need of water stumble into our camp and report the bodies of others who have died nearby. Since the 2016 presidential election, the government has undertaken the task once again to secure the border. The new plan, is to build an even bigger wall. Public land managers who are charged with protecting these places are unlikely to protest this new industrial intrusion into the wilderness, as they have shown more interest in ticking humanitarian aid volunteers and working with Border Patrol and the US Attorney's Office to prosecute those who offer food and water to migrants. Before this desert was a high-intensity border enforcement zone, before it was a protected wilderness, even before it was a geopolitical borderland, it was Hiased Odom territory. These new land uses are but layers on top of a persisting native landscape. Abbey's idea that conservation could find common cause with border militarism is misguided. Instead, conservation in the borderlands, if it is to succeed, must find common cause with humanitarian, human rights, and indigenous rights. Sincerely, Scott Warren. Now I'll read my piece, which is shorter, but which will maybe still bring me slightly past the 10-minute mark, and for that I apologize. This is called Assembly Line Justice. Dear America, every weekday at the federal courthouse in Tucson, Arizona, where I have long lived, dozens of men and women are gathered in a courtroom and made to face the high pulpit of a judge like shackled parishioners. Most of them are young, wearing t-shirts, sneakers, and jeans. Called up in groups of 5, they are each asked the same incantatory set of questions. Do you understand the rights you are giving up? Are you pleading voluntarily and of your own free will? Are you a citizen of the United States? Did you enter southern Arizona from Mexico without coming through a designated port of entry? How do you plead? Culpable, the defendants all say one by one. Guilty. Using a stopwatch, I once timed the proceedings. In less than 4 minutes, each group of 5 was convicted and sentenced to prison terms of up to 180 days. All in all, the court can adjudicate the cases of as many as 75 migrants in as little as an hour and a half. The dogged rhythm of the proceedings means that any deviation is conspicuous. I notice when defendants pause for too long, when they interrupt the judge's questioning to admit that they don't understand, when they tremble at the microphone as they say, I had to leave because they wanted to kill me, or the money in my country isn't enough, or simply, thank you, I'm sorry. I notice when a man from Honduras refuses the black headset that relays Spanish translations from the court interpreter. He has 3 children born in the United States, his lawyer explains. He has made a life in this country. The man answers the judge in confident English, as if to assert, "I belong here." This grim daily ritual, known as Operation Streamline, began well over a decade ago, in 2005, a year in which border apprehensions climbed above 1.1 million. The program was conceived of by the US Border Patrol and the Department of Justice as a way to reduce recidivism and alleviate the overburdening of Southwestern courts by sentencing undocumented border crossers en masse. After a few years, Streamline was reserved for repeat offenders, migrants previously deported from the United States who thus faced felony charges of re-entry in addition to the misdemeanor of entry without inspection. Under the program, defendants agreed to plead guilty to the misdemeanor and waive their constitutional right to appeal in exchange for the dismissal of the more serious felony charge and its associated court fees. Attorneys who represent migrants differ widely in their assessment of the program. Some consider it a good deal, but many others believe it silences their clients in the name of expediency. For a brief moment, in early 2017, it seemed as if Operation Streamline had perhaps outlived its supposed usefulness, even in the eyes of those who had long helped sustain it. After trending downward for years, undocumented crossings reached their lowest point in decades, and there were days when no more than 6 migrants passed through Tucson's cavernous courtroom. Many attorneys and judges questioned the necessity of the operation. It had become a mass hearing without the mass. But then the incoming Trump administration announced its intention to, quote, bring the full weight of both the immigration courts and federal criminal enforcement down on undocumented immigrants. US prosecutors were directed to once again pursue conviction for first-time entrants, expanding the pool of prosecutable border crossers and giving Operation Streamline the numbers boost it needed to survive. By procuring misdemeanor convictions for first-time entrants, the program could effectively dole out more convictions among the dwindling number of arrivals, saddling them with criminal records and a history of deportation. Many here in the borderlands are quick to remind us that changes like these must be understood as an extension of what came before them. When I asked one federal judge about the Trump effect in their streamlined court, they conceded quite plainly, it was already awful. Many attorneys and judges doubt that hardline immigration prosecution even deters would-be migrants in the first place. They don't fear American prisons, a career public defender named Joel Paris once told me. They fear a violent existence, a life without money and opportunity. One summer, I committed myself to spending an entire week in Streamline's immense courtroom. My overwhelming impression was of assembly line justice, of a vast machinery quickly and dispassionately grinding away at the lives of men and women who were forgotten as soon as they were named. It's the same thing 75 times in a row, one judge confessed to me. Sometimes, they continued, it's like an out-of-body experience, and I don't remember what I'm doing or where I am or what I said. Such proceedings desensitize us to the humanity of those with an unwavering hope of becoming part of the fabric of our nation. In many cases, even dispatching those who are already American in every way except on paper. We are being made to look at everyone the same, Joel Paris told me. He is certain, dear America, that such a structure would never be tolerated were it designed for people we consider our own. To stand by as policymakers perfect a mechanism for rejecting outsiders, he warns, is to become blind to the individual lives of those it condemns. Thus, it falls on us now more than ever to gaze without blinking at what is being wrought in our name and to act swiftly against it. In hope and solidarity, Francisco Cantu. I'm really sorry for going so far over time. You can tell I did not practice. I did not time myself, so apologies.
Oh, you're totally fine. Thank you, Francisco, for those 2 amazing essays. And if I could just point out a third really sort of triptych for that essay in the book, it's Amy P. Knight's Thoughts from an Empty Courtroom Following the Hung Jury of a Man Tried for Harboring Migrants. Amy was Scott's attorney when he was tried. And so thank you. I mean, those are such important pieces. Dean Rader has written, edited, or co-edited 11 books, including Works and Days, which won the 2010 T.S. Eliot Prize, Bullets into Bells, Poets and Citizens Respond to Gun Violence, edited with Brian Clements and Alexander Teague, and Self-Portrait as Wikipedia Entry, a finalist for the Oklahoma Book Award and the Northern California Book Award. Recent work has appeared or will appear in the New York Times Magazine, Harvard Review, New England Review, Waxwing, Kenyon Review, Southern Review, Bomb, Plowshares, and Best of the Net, and also terrain.org. And he is a professor at the University of San Francisco and the recipient of a 2019 Guggenheim Fellowship in Poetry. Dean, lead us Twombly into that good night.
Wow, thank you for that great introduction. Francisco, that was great. You can go over really anytime. I cede my time to the gentleman from Arizona. Well done. It's great to read with you and Diana and Sandra. I think I'm just going to read 2 poems, but I might talk a little bit about those poems. Simmons mentioned a book that I co-edited back in 2017 called Bullets into Bells, which was a collection of poems about gun violence. And each of the poems featured a response by a survivor of a shooting, the ER doctor from the Sandy Hook massacre, Tamir Rice's mother. It's this really powerful collection. And of all the poems in the Dear America anthology, one of the ones that jumped out to me the most is a poem by Victoria Chang that originally appeared on the Letters to America website. And I actually write about this poem. I just wrote a review of her book, Obit. I just went up at the Kenyon Review like this week. So I've been thinking about Victoria's book a lot and about the obituary. And as I say in my review, this is a really complicated time to be thinking about the obituary. I can't even say how many obituaries I've read since COVID-19, and I think a lot of us were really thinking a lot about life and death and the obituaries of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And then just the last couple of days, you probably saw or read about the shooting of Judge Esther Salas in New Jersey. So I've been thinking a lot about gun violence still. Anyway, Victoria's poem is part of her book Obit, and it's one of her obituary poems. And the poem is long and cylindrical, right justified. Every poem that is an obit is in the form of an obituary that you might see in a newspaper. And each of the poems has a kind of date line as to who died. This particular poem begins with the death of America. And the date is February 14th, 2018, which is the day of the shooting at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, in which 17 people were killed and 17 were injured. And this is the final obit in her collection. America died on February 14, 2018. And my dead mother doesn't know. Since her death, America has died a series of small deaths, each one less precise than the next. My tears are now shaped like hooks, but my heart is damp still. If it is lucky, it is in the middle of its beats. The unlucky dead children hold telegrams they must hand to a woman at a desk. The woman will collect their belongings in shadows. My dead mother asks each of these children if they know me, have seen me, how tall my children are now. They will tell her that they once lived in Florida, not California. She will see the child with the hole in his head. She will blow the dreams out of the hole like dust. I used to think death was a kind of anesthesia. Now I imagine long lines, my mother taking in all the children. I imagine her touching their hair, how she might tickle their knees to make them laugh. The dead hold the other half of our ticket. The dead are an image of wind. And when they comb their hair, our trees rustle. That is a great poem. When Simmons and Derek approached me about a poem for this super cool anthology, I was and still am mired in this kind of 2-year-long project / obsession with the artist Cy Twombly. I've been writing a lot of poems that kind of enter into conversation with Twombly. And I was thinking about this piece, and in particular, the notion of the letter. This piece actually appears in the anthology. And I was thinking about letters to America and letters for America. And I was very interested in the fact that the word letter is both, the message, the missive that we send, but it's the same word as the individual letter, and how a letter that we might write and send to someone, the macro letter is comprised of a lot of little micro letters. Then I started thinking about the legal associations of the word letter, the letter of the law, what it means to send a letter. And I was thinking about that relationship between the authority of the letter, the imprimatur of a letter being sort of pressed onto a page, and then the letters in this great anthology being sort of pressed into our minds and in our hearts. So my poem is a weird poem, and I'm just going to preface reading it by saying that. And Bergen, if we could go back to the camera, I will demonstrate how. So my poem is kind of in, I don't know if you can see, it's in 2 parts. There's this kind of part that stretches across the page, and then there's a column that runs along. And that column is the OED definition of letter. And so the official definition of the letter is always talking to my poem. And so I was thinking about this whole notion of legibility and access, and the history of letters and the history of writing and laws and legalness in America. And it just got weird from there. So the title of this is called "In Which Twombly and Rader Consider the Letter." In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with the letter. The letter is the beginning, and in the beginning is the letter. First mark, first slash, first line, first sign. Not drawn, but notched, scored, the spoor of speech, the trace, the track of utterance. The invitation not just to see, but to read, to record, to write and rewrite the self into everything it is and is not. Letter within letter, line from writer to reader, sender, receiver. What is life but a correspondence, a notation written and read by and about the self? Dear X, dear Y. Life, like a sentence, ends, but what if the letter is infinite? Dear Twombly, master of the eternal E, unending O, what letter would you write to / for our country? What sign, what scrawl speaks through its own silence into the ear of our brightest hearing? Calligraphic and metonymic all at once. Yes, it is true we may not hear, but we still might read. And yes, it is true that we may not read, but we still might see. Darkness blinds, but only until it is marked by light. Blindness darkens, but only until it is lit by mark. What awaits us, sigh, in the mailboxes of the dead? Here, the glyphs and graphemes of our daily lives seem at best unreadable, at worst struck through. It is time to draw the insurgent word, time to write the letter of our uprising on the envelope that is this land. To the tyranny of edict, I send the erasing angel. To the president of autocracy, I post the cancellation. Thank you.
Right on, Dean. Thank you for reading both of those amazing poems. I remember when you sent us that poem and we were just, I mean, we had to sort of pull ourselves off the floor after reading it. Such an amazing piece. And that's true really for so much of the work in here. So thank you. Dr. Sandra Steingraber is both a biologist and poet. She most recently edited a collection of Rachel Carson's environmental writings for Library of America. Sandra currently serves as Distinguished Scholar in Residence at Ithaca College in upstate New York, where in May 2021, she will launch the Center for Climate Justice. As an infant, Sandra was a ward of the state until adopted by a German-American man who fought the Nazis in World War II. Her contribution to the Dear America anthology, which you will hear next, represents the first time she has written about this part of her biography. Sandra, thank you for sharing your heritage and your wisdom.
Well, thank you, Simmons. And what an honor to be in this company tonight with Diane and Francisco and Dean. And thank you, Simmons, for welcoming me into the Terrain community. I just want our listeners to know tonight that Terrain is a really useful magazine. I used it a year ago in July to come out as a gay woman in a coming out essay. Also in July of last year, shortly after that essay appeared, I was arrested and incarcerated as a direct result of blocking an intersection in Buffalo, New York, speaking out about the practices of the Immigration's Custom Enforcement, ICE. And when, at the time of my arrest, I was carrying a sign that said, "Not a good German." And this, somewhere between an essay and a poem, I guess, is the story, the backstory of this sign I was carrying. And it's enumerated in 10 parts, and I'll go ahead and number the parts as we go to kind of, so you can kind of see how close we are to the end here. Not a good German. 1. Dear America, my last name, Steingraber, means by the stony ditch in German. Am steinigen Graben. It was bequeathed to me by my German American father, who adopted me in 1960. I carry it to honor the man who gave me a family. I want you to start pronouncing it correctly. The A is long. Once there were 2 German dots over that A, but they were quietly dropped by some immigrant somewhere along the way to signal loyalty to you, America. That's what I was told by my Steingraber uncles. I had 7 of them. They all fought the Nazis and they're all dead now, and I can't verify the story. There's so much about your story, America, that I can't verify. A, like the color gray. I'm tired of reminding you every damn time you introduce me at the podium. 2, Dear America, I'd like you to meet my dad, Wilbur F Steingriber, who fought Nazis for 60 years. Will enlisted on his 18th birthday, and you trained him to attack Nazi panzer tanks and shipped him off to Europe. Remember that? The motto of his platoon was seek, strike, and destroy. What happened to him there was never fully disclosed to me before his death in 2005. I can tell you that he suffered for the rest of his life from what we would now call PTSD. All my friends' fathers had the same problem. We never talked about it. We just tiptoed around our dads, who we were warned could blow up at any moment, like unexploded ordnance. 3. Dear America, something bad happened in Italy. It had to do with guard duty and war refugees. That's all I know, and I don't expect further details from you. Fine, keep your secrets. I do want you to know that Will was never able to take a walk at dusk. He closed the drapes before sunset. Our door had many locks. Paper bags in the road triggered panic attacks. America, you made my dad afraid of paper bags. Unexploded ordnance. Here's the point. He flew the flag every day for you, America. 4. Dear America, he taught me to be brave. Lesson from Dad. When you carry around a name like Steingraber, you can't be a good German. If fascism needs fighting, you fight. 5. Dear America, Wilbur F Steingriber was a big believer in willpower. This is how my dad willed away the Nazis. He read Rachel Carson. He started an organic garden. He made candles, hundreds of candles. He made doll houses, dozens of doll houses. He took up embroidery. Yes, he did. He embroidered big-eyed children and puppies and sunflowers, and he hung them everywhere. He never lit the candles. He bought yarn in bulk, also ice cream. He bought a chest freezer to hold all the ice cream, plus all the organic tomatoes. He bought chainsaws in bulk. When the hedges in the front yard became large enough for Nazis to hide in, he chainsawed them down. And at some point, PTSD skidded straight into dementia. I want you to know that my mom and my sister and I feel bad about how late we were in picking up on this. We tiptoed too long. It was me who made the chainsaws disappear. I also rat-holed his car keys. My sister took the rifle. America, when Julian Steingraber attempted to turn Wilbur F. Steingraber's firearm into the local sheriff, she received a lecture on the Second Fucking Amendment. Was this really necessary? At this point, Will was seeing Nazis in the hallway, and he wasn't sure how a spoon worked. 6. Dear America, it is true. My dad stabbed a nurse with a fork. He said it was his duty under the German convention to escape. And when I called the VA, they told me they didn't have facilities for combative patients. And me yelling, "Are you fucking kidding me? You made him a combatant in 1944 and he's still fighting the Nazis." Well, that didn't help at all. The second to the last conversation I had with my father took place in a locked Alzheimer's unit paid for with a lien on our mom's house on the 60th anniversary of D-Day. Dad wasn't sure who I was, but we conversed about Rommel's offensive in North Africa. In my last conversation, America, my dad pointed at my son and he said, "Keep him out of the lane." Wilbur F. Steingriber was big on protecting kids above all else. America. 7. Dear America, on July 11th, 2019, I was arrested in downtown Buffalo and charged with disorderly conduct and unlawful assembly. This was an act of civil disobedience conducted in coordination with the nationwide #CloseTheCamps movement. With my actions, which were glorious and involved shutting down a major city intersection for several hours, I sought to highlight abuses within migrant detention camps here in New York. Specifically, in Buffalo, my actions were directed at shining a spotlight on the real estate developers who are shamefully leasing office space to the wretched Immigration Customs Enforcement, ICE, and the wretched Customs and Border Protection, CBP. From the investigation, and I quote, the federal government lease, which covers ICE, Homeland Security Investigation Offices and Enforcement and Removal Operation Offices, as well as its holding cell in downtown Buffalo, will yield $1,953,161 in rent in 2019. So, at the time of my arrest, I was sitting in the intersection of Chippewa and Delaware Avenues between a hospice chaplain and a military veteran. Further down the blockade line was a Jewish activist and a member of the Seneca Nation who, as an indigenous child, had been forcibly adopted out of her birth family and raised in a white family. Left, right, they ran toward us in formation, the police, bearing their batons like candles. We began singing. Basically, America, you are a nation of adoptees, some abandoned and some kidnapped. Are you listening? 8. Dear America, civil disobedience arises as an act of individual conscience informed by our various identities. America, my name moved me to action, and the sign I carried at the time of my arrest said, "Not a good German." I'll explain it again. A good German was a citizen of Germany during the 1930s and 40s who said that they opposed the Nazis, but who in fact did nothing to act on their opposition. A good German was someone who later, when it all came out, claimed that they had no idea about the atrocities taking place in the concentration camps or about the deportations of Jews and other named undesirables. A good German sees and hears no evil. A good German chooses not to go there. A good German believes the lies. A good German doesn't believe the lies, but substitutes cynicism for action. To be a good German is to have convictions, but not the courage thereof. To be a good German is to decide that the thing to do is focus on making a really good cup of coffee. To be a good German is to become the meme dog in the meme flames who drinks good coffee and says, "This is fine." Edward Abbey, quote, "Sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul," unquote. To be a good German is to be a ruined soul. 9. Dear America, thank you for that warm introduction. It's an honor to be here. 10. Dear America, I saw you in the lane at dusk. Who is that lying face down in the stony ditch? Thank you.
I think I speak for all of us when I say, wow. Let's just give that a moment to settle upon us. Thank you, Sandra. And thank all of our readers tonight for this amazing reading. Now, we're almost at time, but I'm going to keep everybody here because I have a few words to say, and then we have at least one really great question and perhaps some others coming in. And I know nobody's going to leave us just yet. So before turning to that Q&A, I want to announce the next in our series of town hall readings. We have one planned each month until the election. Terrain.org nonfiction editor Elizabeth Dodd will moderate the August event, the theme of which is ambient violence, clear vision to face inequities, to face injustices, with Camille Dungy, Allison Hedgecoke, Heather Ryan, and Todd Boss. It'll take place August 19th at 5 p.m., which is also 5 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Mountain time, 7 p.m. Central time, 8 p.m. Eastern time. You can register now from Facebook or terrain.org or tupress.org or at dearamericabook.org. And you can also purchase Dear America at 20% off using the discount code Town Hall in all caps, that's Town Hall all together, at dearamericabook.org as well. And one more thing, speaking of Dear America, I can tell you that it makes a wonderful textbook and comes with, courtesy of education editor Janine DeBase and terrain.org, some substantial discussion and writing prompts and multimedia resources, which you can find online at terrain.org/dear-america. So now, on to the questions. And I'm going to start with this first one. Let me swing it over here, if I can. From Susan Hansen. Scott Warren's comments about Edward Abbey's racist attitudes bring to mind today's news story about John Muir's support of white supremacy. It should come as no surprise that these heroes of the environmental movement are no saints, and yet we don't quite know what to make of their flaws. Can you to this dilemma? Francisco, can I start with you?
Yeah, I think it's something that you know, we've been thinking about, not just with, you know, for our cultural figures in every field. And I think, you know, what's important is to not just like mention it and then move on with business as usual, you know, like mention it and then move swiftly to the canonized myth of these figures as it exists. I think that, you know, what progress looks like is, you know, I don't think that you strike these people from the canon either. I think, like, you know, how could you? I think Ed Abbey has played such a big role in you know, radicalizing generations of activists, of giving people environmental consciences. But I think you have to spend as much time, you know, discussing their problematic notions and ideas as you do, you know, sort of rolling out the pre-existing myth and you know, ticking off the established boxes. You know, otherwise I think it's a disservice. You're like perpetuating the dark side of you know, their blind spots. And so I think you have to bring those things out in the open, and you have to trust that people are able to, you know, continue reading and exposing themselves to the art that these people created, and benefiting something from it, but also like learning something from it. You know, and I think like to just say something and move past it, or to not say something at all, is to sort of just like be complicit in, you know, the misogyny or the racism, or what have you.
To be a good German. Diana, what do you think?
I think, yeah, I largely agree with what Francisco has said here. These kind of people don't exist in a vacuum, right? And I think it's really important to think about the larger context in which they exist, all of the forces that have allowed certain types of men to rise up and become canonized in this way. I think for every Edward Abbey, there's many more voices that have been silenced and not heard for a long time. So when you're thinking about like the kind of contributions that one like he made to, you know, our understanding of the environmental movement, I think it's really important to understand that there are so many voices that have been silenced this entire time and are still being silenced, right? So when I think about, like, you know, what do we make of this? Like, I agree, you can't ignore it. You can't just like be like, well, let's just look at the art and not the artist, right? Like this, age-old problem of like, do we separate the art from the artist? I don't think you can. I think you have to understand that there are larger forces at work that propelled someone like Abby into the mainstream, into people's consciousness as a writer, and understand that there are a lot of people still missing.
Yeah, thank you. Dean, I know that you've taught for a while and obviously written a lot of poetry. What are your maybe perspective as a teacher?
Well, first of all, that's a great question to pose. Sadly, environmentalists don't own, racism. It seems it's prevalent. Actually, I was thinking as Diana and Francisco were talking, I teach in the Honors College here at USF, and I teach this seminar every so often called The American Experience. And I like to begin with these kind of early foundational texts about America. And one of the things I teach every year is Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia. And he's got one on slavery. And I don't know if any of you have ever read it. Not many people have come across it, but he lays out in great detail, in painstakingly grotesque detail, why the African race is inferior to the white race. And this is someone who has got to be, at this moment in history, one of the most articulate thinkers. I mean, he is the author of America and some of the best American ideals. And his thinking is so deeply flawed that it is hard for my students to wrap their heads around it. And as Diana suggests, I also teach him in conversation with a really little known Native American author called William Apess, A-P-E-S-S. And if you guys don't know his work, really look it up. He's writing these very sophisticated, very articulate rhetorical essays for indigenous sovereignty grounded in Christian ideology almost 100 years before Emerson. And so, as Diana suggests, a lot of these voices are often silenced over time by the canon makers. But so when people say, well, there really wasn't anyone else writing these liberative pieces, you can say, well, here's William Apess, who is outthinking Jefferson, writing before Jefferson could have sort of opened up his brain. So one of the things I think is so interesting about this anthology is how it captures these contradictions of America, how at this time in the 1700s, there were such horribly and amazingly contradictive writings happening, but we only get just a sliver, and even that sliver isn't really even taught. So I feel like there's this kind of excavation work that has to happen. I actually have a poem that appeared in the Kenyon Review called History, about having my son walk in the room during the Charlottesville riots a couple of years ago, that has an epigraph from the Jefferson Notes on Slavery. And it's this kind of amazing mashup of when the slave ships arrived in Virginia to him thinking about America.
Thank you. Sandra, why don't we close with you?
Well, I want to underscore Diana's point. Of course, I appreciate all the points here that, how many voices were silenced because of the ones that we can't canonized. And often the ones that we can't canonize themselves silenced voices, right? I mean, I believe as a writer, as an ecologist, as somebody who has a long-standing place in the environmental movement, that environmentalism is shot through with racism and misogyny, such that there's a long-standing exclusion, and now we're at a point of the climate crisis where it's clear that the climate crisis is a racial crisis. The people hurt first and worst are not white, and they're not men. And we can hardly have a conversation about that because the whole language and culture and history of environmentalism there's no kind of cultural space for that conversation. So it's exciting to see the kind of monuments of all kinds, including monuments of language that Dean just taught us about, that kind of falling away. So we hopefully there are letters, new letters, right? New letters of the alphabet, to be able to speak and imagine these things. I mean, there was a new study out last week that I keep thinking a lot about that showed that white people actually make more air pollution than they breathe. And people of color breathe more air pollution than they make, right? And then, of course, air pollution is just another name for fossil fuel combustion byproducts. And so the climate is also, and therefore all of the life support system that we have, and everything that allows our civilization to continue is being destroyed through emissions that white people are making, and everyone else that's not white is breathing in. So how can we even begin to talk about that? How can groups like the Sierra Club, who has the founder and the original board of directors that they do, open a space for that? I'm really interested in that. And I found myself also thinking while listening to all of you talking about another one of our fellow poets, Carolyn Randall Williams, who wrote that amazing op-ed in the New York Times. I think it was called "You Want a Confederate Monument, My Body as a Confederate Monument," right? Who's a biracial woman who's almost all of the men that she comes from, her people, she calls them, were rapists who raped the Black women who were either they owned or who they employed, and and so her body itself is a monument to something that we're trying to deconstruct. And I can't stop thinking about that essay because it's like the opposite of my own life as an abandoned infant, right? Who doesn't have a heritage and doesn't know who my people are in any way, but was adopted by a man who was a German American immigrant who had to go off to Europe and fight against his own people. And he actually saw as a combatant. I don't actually know if my father saw it or all 7 of these guys, and my uncle's right, were all in the war. So the stories get confused. It may have been my uncle who saw another Steingraber, who was a German held as a POW by our troops, and looked at him across the barbed wire, knowing that they were probably somehow related, right? And so I'll be thinking for the rest of my life about what it means. I mean, I feel aligned with all the other dispossessed people of the world, right? And yet to be adopted into a German American family and taught to not be a German is some kind of double thing, double cancellation. I mean, to use Dean's word here. But there's something new and brave that I got from all that. Having no heritage and sinking my taproot down deep into kind of the tribe that we all belong to somehow. And then finding such meaning in Carolyn Williams' idea that her own body is a monument to something that we're trying to tear apart. It resonates with me. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you, and thank you all. And we have some other questions, but I think that's a good, really powerful discussion to end this session on. Again, I want to thank Diana Babineau and Francisco Cantu and Dean Rader and Sandra Steingraber for your such amazing work and being such important citizens of the world. Thank you for being in the anthology. Thank you to everybody who joined us here today. We will be posting this recording on terrain.org and on Trinity University Press's YouTube page in the near future. And again, join us next month on August 19th at 5 p.m. for another amazing reading. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.